Hi everyone, I'm very excited to be making another video today with my friend and coworker Jordan. And our video is on the topic of autism and the death penalty. So Jordan, do you want to start out with maybe explaining what case we're going to talk about and why we think it's important?
Sure. We're going to be discussing a case from a man by the name of Robert Roberson, who back in 2002 was arrested for the death for the murder of his 2-year-old child, Nikki, and has since been given the death penalty and is scheduled to be executed on October 17th. And there are many out there, including doctors, scientists, and even the detective that initially prosecuted the case that now seem to believe that the evidence was misleading and incorrect in various ways. And we're going to be discussing whether or not Robert Roberson really is guilty for the death of his daughter and what to do about that if he is in fact not as we believe him to be. So yeah, I guess we should start by we can keep going by talking a little bit about what the actual charge is. And the charge was that back in 2022, excuse me, back in 2002, so this actually was over 20 years ago. Wow. But Robert Robertson brought his 2-year-old daughter into the hospital after she stopped breathing, and she was found dead. And she was pronounced as having shaken baby syndrome. Basically, it was decided that they believed that that her father had killed her through shaking. This is something that does sometimes happen, unfortunately, horribly.
Just an interjector, I believe she was alive when she was brought to the hospital,
Yes.
but she died shortly.
Yeah, she was brought to the hospital, but I believe even by that time she was brain dead from lack of oxygen getting to the brain.
Yes.
That only takes about 10 minutes.
Yeah.
But basically, at the time, back in 2001, they had developed I'm not sure if it was a law or a guideline, but some unscientific source basically uh, decided that if a if a if an infant or a child comes to the hospital with the following three symptoms, with three certain symptoms, it would be believed that they were dead of shaken baby syndrome.
Jordan mentioned there is essentially a triad of symptoms that they would look for, and if the triad was present, there was a hypothesis initially that that would indicate that the baby had been shaken. But I believe the researcher who put forward the hypothesis was concerned that his hypothesis was being used to result in convictions before being adequately tested. And that seemed to be what happened in this case, where some of these symptoms were found, and Mr. Roberson was essentially presumed to be guilty based on them without adequate consideration of the child's medical history leading up to that, or the fact that he was autistic and didn't know that at the time.
Yeah, that brings up, you just brought up two important points that I think we should go into one by one. And the first one is, as you said, the daughter Nikki's medical history. That's something that was not brought up when indicating when the doctor was deciding whether or not this child had shaken baby syndrome. It was something that wasn't very much discussed until way after the fact.
So Jordan, can you maybe describe the medical history of Nikki and what kind of led up to?
Sure. So that's something that wasn't really talked about too much at the time of this arrest in this case, but it's pretty relevant that Nikki had a fairly extensive history of medical complications. She had several infections from like right after she was born. At one point, she needed to have surgery where they put tubes into her ears, and she also suffered from apnea and would sometimes suddenly stop breathing, which is very relevant to what happened the night in question.
But kind of going back to what Jordan mentioned earlier about the visits that Nikki had just in the couple of days before or week before her unfortunate death, she had been seen in the ER. I believe she'd had vomiting and some similar symptoms for a while, and Mr. Robertson and his mother had brought her into the ER. And she was prescribed a medication that now actually has a FDA black box warning for children of her age. And then she went back, developed a high fever. Mr. Robertson brought her in to see a pediatrician. And she was prescribed more of the same medication, and she was also prescribed an opioid, which is now also not prescribed to children of that age because of potential for breathing difficulties.
The opioid was codeine, correct?
Codeine, yeah.
And what was the other one? It was
Phenargin.
something like
Yeah.
Phenargin or Pentagram, something like
Yeah.
that.
But yeah, and then at the time of her death, it turned out that she actually had toxic levels of this medication in her system. And when the as Jordan mentioned, when the abuse expert in Dallas had looked at her case, the person talked to law enforcement, talked to her maternal grandparents, who said that she had seen fine the night before, but we know that that can't be true because she had just been seen, you know, in the hospital and
With
the
103
the
and then
morning of,
104.
and critically, the pediatrician did not, at Dallas, who made this diagnosis of shaken baby syndrome, apparently did not review her medical history.
It's also worth noting that the grandparents asked Robert to pick her up that night. Robert brought her to her maternal grandparents, who at the time he was having a battle of custody with, but later that night they called him and asked him to take her back, which he did, and then they had a pretty difficult night, which according to the descriptions of the night given by Robert, he stayed up for much of the night with her. He was trying to stay with her, and he fell asleep in the room with her. And the next morning when he woke up, she had fallen from the bed. Her lips were blue. She was not breathing. He tried to resuscitate her. It did not work. So he called the hospital, and she was admitted, and I believe she was transferred to a different hospital because the hospital they were at was not well enough equipped. So she was sent to Dallas. And I also believe that by the time she was seen by a doctor in Dallas, that doctor had received reports basically saying that they had decided already that Nikki had been shaken, that she had been shaken to death and died of shaken baby syndrome. And no further investigation was really taken by the doctor in Dallas. It was kind of taken by face value. And part of the reasons that they believed that was Nikki had 2 of the 3 symptoms that you're supposed to look for with shaken baby syndrome, but medical staff also described Robert at the time as not showing signs of grief, which ties into one of the major points about this case, which is that Robert Roberson at the time had undiagnosed autism, and it is quite possible, even likely, that the subjective descriptions that the staff had of him of not being sufficiently in grief could easily just have been them not understanding what grief can look like in people with autism. It can look very different. They're not people with autism are not always super expressive. Sometimes we are, but it definitely depends. But people grieve in different ways, and the way in which his grief was manifesting, I would assume that he was grieving, but they did not see it that way, and that led them to be suspicious of him, which is something that happens to autistic people more often, I'd say, than the general public.
Yeah, definitely. I think sometimes we feel emotions more internally, and maybe express them very directly with words, but people often expect a certain facial expression or nonverbal communication of emotions in a specific way.
Definitely a person by person thing.
Yes.
I'm very expressive, but and just to be clear, I guess I think it's worth pointing out. So it seems likely that Nikki's death was, if not caused, at least moved along by the prescription of these drugs that we know now are unsafe to give to small children. I think it's important to point out that's not the same as like nobody is blaming the doctors who were using
No.
medicine that at the time was was considered safe that we now know is unsafe. But just like that shouldn't be used against any medical practitioners who were wrong at the time, it also needs to be taken into account and remembered when we're talking about whether or not to find a man guilty of killing his child, especially when the consequences of being found guilty are death row.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, thank you for that clarification as well.
Regardless of your feelings on the death penalty, I think that we all agree that we do not want to see it be applied to innocent people.
Yeah. And another reason that we think disability comes into play here is the fact that when Mr. Robertson was, I guess, communicating with hospital staff, in addition to them not understanding why he wasn't expressing emotion in a certain way, he also found it challenging to communicate Nikki's medical history.
Which can be difficult for anybody
Yeah.
under such grief
Yeah,
moment.
yes. But that means that during the trial, her medical history was very much overlooked completely. And
I personally find it kind of odd that at no point during this did people see it worthwhile to look into the medical history. It seems kind of like working backwards from your conclusion.
yeah, there have been 3 medical experts since then who have looked at data and found that, firstly, that her brain scans were very consistent with impact of just a single fall. And then 2 other people found that, sorry, 2 other clinicians found that she very likely passed away from pneumonia. They did an analysis of sample from her lung and found that she had 2 types of infections and that she also likely developed sepsis, which could have also contributed to the brain inflammation.
Yeah.
And neither of us are medical experts, so we may
No.
not be. We'll link to the articles where these are described more fully in case we're not using them.
And it's definitely worth like asking these questions and going into like getting scrutinous about like whether or not it holds up, whether or not he did, because like if he did kill his baby through shaking it, that is like legitimate to want to know and to like be concerned about. And like one of the main points of contention that the prosecution pointed to that I think is worth going into was the question of her fall from her bed. Robert reported when he woke up that his daughter had fallen from her bed, and doctors did find she had a bruise on the back of her head that was consistent with that. But there was a question of whether a fall from that height would be enough to kill a small child. It was I think that the conclusion ultimately came down to, yes, it can sometimes be a large enough fall to kill. But it's definitely worth going into that because that bed was relatively low to the ground and suspended on cinder blocks, if I am not mistaken.
Yes.
So,
Right.
you know, important to get into all of it.
So I know one thing that we were thinking about discussing when we were planning this video is how this applies more generally, just beyond Mr. Robertson's case. So
Yeah.
what are ways that you see interactions of law enforcement and or the criminal justice systems often being challenging or disproportionately penalizing for people with disabilities?
There are a number of ways in which people with disabilities are just naturally more vulnerable to antagonistic relationships with law enforcement. Because there are many things that people with disabilities, and particularly people with autism, do that can be seen as innately suspicious if someone doesn't know any better. Like one of the major symptoms talked about with autism is lack of eye contact, not looking people in the eye. And that's something, if you're averting people's gaze, that's something that cops can sometimes find suspicious. Echolalia, which is the repeating of words that can be misconstrued as mocking a cop or saying guilty. If a cop's like, "Are you guilty?" and you repeat guilty, it could easily be misconstrued as, you know, admitting to a crime you did not commit, and that can just be a nightmare in court. And hearing loss or deafness can often can be perceived as non-compliance if the person doesn't know that you have like a hearing impairment. Fidgeting, stimming, something that you've probably been watching both of us do with this entire video. Is, or maybe not, you can't see below my hands, but it can be seen as like a threat or possibly as a sign that you're on substances, which is sometimes a sign the police feels that they should do something about that. And also just sometimes in like very high stress situations, a person with autism might panic. They might start having an episode or run or possibly even aggress. And it's really important in those situations to have an officer that knows how to de-escalate or tragedies can occur. And it's also important to point out that these kinds of issues are even bigger issues with people who are undiagnosed with autism, people who have it but do not know they have it because they don't even have like the ability to describe what's going on, and it's very easy to just be profiled as dangerous for those characteristics, especially if you don't have a way to you know explain yourself, be it by yourself or be it by some kind of contact or a card or some kind of communication that you can use to make that clear to an officer.
Yeah, and there are also definitely disproportionately problems for people who are profiled by the police for other reasons, whether it's race, socioeconomic status, or anything else.
It is worth noting that Robert Roberson is of lower socioeconomic status.
Yes, yeah. Paradoxically, I think sometimes that the intense honesty that a lot of people have can itself be misconstrued, where if someone is correcting an officer because they want to be transparent and honest, because that's what we're told that we're supposed to do, that can be perceived as a challenge. Or if someone's giving a lot of detail in an attempt to be really comprehensive, that can again be looked upon negatively. So
people do not like being corrected.
yes, that's true. Yeah, that is like a whole other video topic, how to get past the defensiveness of humanity.
When you figure out how to do that, send me the link.
I don't know how you can solve that problem myself, let alone the world at large.
Oh yeah. What else should we delve into?
Well, I
What
guess we
have we
should
not
probably,
gotten into
yeah,
yet?
probably the most important thing actually, which is the reason we're making this video is because we think this is, a very concerning case and literally life or death for the person. And we're encouraged that there has been a lot of publicity around it. And I found out about it through the New York Times. So
John Grisham of
maybe,
all people is involved.
yeah, so maybe there's enough momentum going that it will already get resolved, but we don't want to count on that, especially because there have been human rights issues regarding disability that have been well publicized and not resolved. And so we wanted to do, I guess, whatever small part that we can to spread awareness of this and also encourage people to take action. So
especially if you happen to live in the state of Texas,
yes,
your voice means more on this topic than ours
yes,
in North Carolina.
definitely. There is a petition that we can add from the Innocence Project, or sorry, called Project Innocence. And then we would also encourage anyone to contact the governor of Texas, and is there anyone else?
Attorney General, maybe?
Yeah, maybe the Attorney General. We also welcomed, we don't really have the answers here.
Yeah, if you know anyone,
someone to contact, like feel free to.
Yeah, if you know of anyone in like the Texas judicial system or really anywhere along that line that might have advice or like have recourses, especially if it's someone who may be sympathetic, if there's anyone in the state legislature or any of the state government who has an autistic relative or has a understanding of just how like scary it would be to see that autistic relative or somebody in your life that you care about who has autism be profiled for the quirks of their personality and guilt to be assumed for them on a case that the science does not back up now that we understand more than what happened at the time.
Well, is there anything else that you wanted to add on the topic of disability justice policy, I guess, in general?
I mean, part of it is just having a system that is more flexible for the quirks of humanity that we still don't fully understand. Humans are not something that you can just easily put in a box, and behavior is hard to just define as like always a sign of good and always a sign of evil. And it's important that we be able to grow and adapt as our understanding grows and adapts, and our compassion to be able to be transmitted to others who might be a little bit stranger, but aren't actually doing any harm.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's someone named Brian Morton who was the lead detective in Mr. Roberson's case, and now very much believes that Mr. Roberson is innocent and is doing what he can to try and see him receive clemency. But even beyond that, I guess this case has really changed his view on the death penalty completely. And one quotation he had, I really liked. It said, "We as human beings are incapable of producing the kind of fairness and justice required to take someone's life." So I kind of just wanted to end on that quotation.
I want to give major props to him. It takes a lot of courage, especially in today's day and age, to admit when you think that you were wrong. And I really respect that he's using his platform to try and right a wrong. I think we can learn from that, and I hope that he is successful in getting the word out there.
Yeah.
And actually keeping this innocent man from being murdered by the state for something he did not do.
Well,
something that the evidence does not indicate he did. I guess it's worth also pointing out, we might not ever know for sure whether he definitely murdered his daughter or not. But in our judicial system, excuse me, the burden of proof lies on the prosecution, and we are not meant to presume guilt. We are meant to presume innocence, and not until there is not a reasonable doubt that the person actually committed the crime, not until then can we define them as guilty. And I think that is an especially important thing to remember when the stakes of being found guilty are death. And I think it's fair to say that even all of the scientific discussion and all of the new evidence and our new understanding of medicine, even all of that doesn't say, no, he definitely didn't kill her. It was definitely just like all of this other stuff. But there's so much other stuff to consider. Her medical history, what was going on with her medically, even just that night, the fact that they were using an outdated way of diagnosing shaken baby syndrome, the fact that previous medical history wasn't even taken into account during the trial. All of these things create a body of evidence that it's certainly possible that he didn't kill his daughter. And that means that if we go through with this execution, we as a society are possibly murdering a man whose only crime was losing his daughter, was his daughter dying.
Yeah. Well, Jordan, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for bringing this issue to my attention, Sam.
Yeah, absolutely.